Today I want to talk to you about one of the most shocking cases from my psychiatry training. And perhaps it's even one of the most disturbing cases I ever treated as a psychiatrist. It involves a patient who intentionally made herself sick, almost to the point of death, recurrently, in order to take on this sick role, to be admitted to the hospital. And this wasn't even the most disturbing part of the case. What really shocked me was the role that social media played in this. And this case really demonstrates how we as providers can unintentionally, through our own empathy, reinforce this type of behavior. And social media can magnify it in ways that would have been unheard of years ago. So this is a very fascinating story, so I hope you stick with me through it. But if you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm Dr. Robert. I'm a board-certified psychiatrist, and on this channel, I enjoy making mental health videos. And today's educational video will focus on this one particular case that's really interesting. And of course, because it is so interesting, so attention-grabbing, I'm sure anybody who has ever treated this patient has not forgotten the details of it. So I've gone through great lengths to make sure I change details, blend a few cases that are very similar that I personally treated together to protect patient identity. But of course, my experiences, my takeaways, and the underlying lessons learned from this case are very much real. I'll call this patient Robin, and I'll never forget the first time I met her. So at the time, I was a brand new psychiatry intern. I'd only been several months in the residency program. I just completed medical school, so I was still getting a footing as a psychiatrist. And it was one of my first overnight calls where I was by myself. So no supervisors there working with me, only someone available by phone in case of emergency. So I got this page soon into my shift starting, and it requested taking psychiatric precautions off for this particular patient that was just admitted overnight. And on first glance, looking at the patient's chart, I was kind of confused as well. It was a young woman coming in for a blood infection, and the medical team that admitted her placed her on psychiatric observation. Basically, she wasn't allowed visitors. She had to have a camera in the room monitoring her the whole time, and a few other precautions. And when I called the nursing staff back, who had paged me, they said that the patient had requested this, and they were also a bit frustrated that she was on all these precautions, and yet she was just there for an infection, nothing psych here. So I thought, fair enough. And by chance, I happened to click on the little button at the top of her chart that opened up her outside medical records. And that immediately struck my attention. I saw that there were dozens and dozens and dozens of entries from all these various medical hospitals in this city, surrounding cities, in the entire state of Illinois. And that was a bit unusual, especially for a young person. So I started to click through some of them. And it seemed like there were a lot of recurrent blood infections, other types of infections. And that was a little bit suspicious. As I read through some of the notes, I started to pick up on some phrases that really caught my attention. And those included suspicion that these are self-inflicted. Pattern appears self-imposed. I remember thinking to myself, wait, is this actually factitious disorder? It's a condition, a very rare condition, a very lethal condition that I'd only heard about in medical school. I'd learned about it, but I'd never seen a case of it. I was told it was fairly rare, and also very, very dramatic when you do encounter it. And I honestly only really seen examples of it on TV shows, mainly Dr. House. So not the best representation of it. And at this point, I was equal parts fascinated and nervous. But before I continue with the dramatic events of what actually happened next, let's take a moment to actually explore what factitious disorder is. It's a mental health diagnosis, also known as Munchausen syndrome. That's a former name of it, so some people still call it that, whereby someone intentionally fabricates, exaggerates, or induces medical symptoms in themselves in order to gain attention. And by attention, I specifically mean a sick role. It takes on a sick role. And this is different than trying to induce these types of things, make yourself sick to, let's say, get out of court, gain disability, and these other kind of external gains. It's a much more internal thing. So someone needs a validation of a sick role. So as you can probably see, this is a very complex psychological phenomenon. And to better appreciate it, let's take a moment to explore what the sick role is. Basically, it's being someone sick in the context of other people. And when you take on a sick role, whether you actually are sick, I'm sure many of us can remember from being kids, right? When we're sick, people nurture us, people care for us, they pay attention to us, they hear us out. And most importantly, they organize around you when you're sick. And they actually care. People truly care when you're ill. Their empathy kicks in, and you get to experience that. And that's most often a good thing. But let's say if you have someone who has a lot of emotional trauma, is very emotionally wounded, they've been traumatized, neglected growing up, then the sick role can take on a different flavor. It can become even emotionally intoxicating. They can start to feel like embodying the sick role is the only way that they can gain attention, that they can gain caring from others. And the more they take on the sick role, the more that idea, that pattern is reinforced in them. And in rare instances, this can progress onto factitious disorder, which unfortunately the prognosis for is fairly poor. People do struggle with insight, with being able to even acknowledge that this is going on. And oftentimes, too often, it can even be life-threatening, where people induce illness in themselves. And either that action itself leads to their death, or the interventions carried out by medical professionals to treat whatever they did to themselves in the hospital or outside the hospital. Those interventions themselves can lead to death as well. But now let's return to Robin. So after I've reviewed her chart, I decided it'd be best for me to go assess the patient, right? That's often the next thing to do after your chart review, gather some information, is you want to go talk to the patient for yourself and get a sense of what's going on, what's their mental state. So I made my way upstairs from the call room to the medical floor where she was admitted, and I found her room, knocked on it, and then slowly opened the door and entered. And what I saw completely shocked me. I couldn't believe my eyes. There were balloons, chocolates, boxes, presents everywhere. Get well cards, more than I could even count at a single glance. And it looked less like a hospital room and perhaps more like, I don't know, the hospital gift shop on Valentine's Day. That's how dramatic the sight was. I didn't even notice the patient for a while. I was just kind of stuck looking around. And then I heard a voice saying, "Those are from my followers." And that's when I looked left and I saw the hospital bed finally, with some IVs leading to a very fragile looking young woman laying in the hospital bed covered by bed sheets. I could only see her face and her very thin hands. And she looked very frail, looked sick, and certainly I was definitely concerned for her. And of course I introduced myself and I told her I was from the psychiatry team. As soon as I uttered the word psychiatry, her face shifted. She grew from looking very sad, perhaps yearning for attention, to very stiff. And her features kind of froze. Any trace of prior warmth just disappeared. Pulled a stool beside her bed, sat down, and I asked her what was going on. I just want to get a sense of what brought her in and how she was feeling. She very quickly got to it. She started telling me that she has chronic severe mental illnesses, very rare illnesses that are difficult for healthcare providers to manage, and she needs specialty care. And it was imperative that she get, constant vigilant care from nurses because her medical symptoms can cause her to crash at any moment. She started telling me about how too many providers in the past, they didn't see the trees in the forest, and used all these kind of analogies, and was trying to make me feel like I should be guilty for being there or for perhaps not taking her seriously enough. I was kind of trying to preempt any discussion that maybe she wasn't ill. And honestly, if I hadn't reviewed her chart, if it was my first time there, especially as a new intern, I would have fully believed her and empathized with her. And I did, to be clear, empathize with her. Her situation was very tragic, knowing what I knew, but not for the reasons she thought I had empathy. After a moment, I could even tell she was speaking about her medical illnesses needing to be taken seriously. It almost sounded like a script, something rehearsed and she'd gone over multiple times before. And then eventually, after speaking for a while, she got to it. She said it was absolutely unacceptable that she was on psychiatric precautions, that she was being monitored, not allowed visitors. Then she asked me to have the precautions lifted and everything would be okay. Just to make it clear to you guys out there, even if I'd wanted to, even if I'd believed her and tried to lift them, because I was still a fresh intern, I had to run such big decisions still by the attending. So give attending a call and ask them if that was okay. And so I told her this. I told her, unfortunately, I couldn't do that. It wasn't up to me. I would have to speak with my supervisor. And I couldn't even finish my sentence. What happened next froze me. She started screaming, "No, psych, no, psych, no, psych." Screaming it and screaming it. The nurses ran in. I could tell they looked visibly upset. They looked at me as though I just walked in and screamed insults at her, and now she was reacting to that. So they looked very, very upset with me, in fact. And so I just kind of made my way out of the room. Kind of escaped there, and I could still hear the screams down the hall as I made my way to the elevator to go back to the call room and get my thoughts together. So let's take a moment here again to reflect on some of the really fascinating dynamics that come up in factitious disorder. Because reflecting back on that moment later on, I could see the sort of dynamic that played out in the unit, right? She would come into a hospital system recurrently and create this kind of dichotomy, this split between providers. Those who were willing to help her, siding with her, helping nurture her sick role, and those who opposed it. And those immediately became the villains, such as me in that moment, right? And the nurses would turn against me as well. So peeling back the layers of this condition, right? There's this intense need by the individual to have a sense of nurturing, have a sense of support, of their identity being formed and reinforced around this sick role. And if there's any threat to that, that can be highly destabilizing. It can feel intolerable. And of course, this doesn't excuse the dangerous behavior of these individuals, but it helps one understand it, helps one understand why this is happening, why these dangerous behaviors arise in the first place. It helps create some sense of empathy there as well. And now in the age of social media, there's this added layer in these conditions of reinforcement, right? As you saw, there were all these gifts, all these things that this patient had in her room to help reinforce that sick role. And that all came from her social media followers. And so the sick role follows her outside the hospital as well. I'm sure in between hospital stays, right? A lot of posts, a lot of updates, a lot of identity formation around this sick role. And I'm sure, right, social media reinforcing a sick role is not the only dangerous or harmful belief that it can reinforce. We can see that in many different other parts of life. And of course, I don't mean to diminish the illness narratives of many people out there, right, who struggle with cancer and multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, other just conditions that they do use social media for some level of support, education to others. That can definitely be helpful, but in other situations, like in this one, it can be very, very, very harmful. And years later, I would learn that there are even these corners of the internet where people use illness to create a sense of identity. And they have many followers and they display these illnesses. They're definitely suspicious sounding, whether they're real or not, that do gain a lot of traction. And people really do start following and believing and identifying with, even in some cases. There are definitely examples out there, right, of probably the most notorious ones of multiple personality disorder, right? People claiming that they have dozens of personalities that communicate with each other, have relationships with each other, kind of beyond the bounds of what we know is actually possible. But there are large followings for that sort of thing. And you can start to understand that if someone's been neglected early on in life, experienced emotional trauma, taking on a sick role can help reinforce a sense of belonging. And then social media, that sense of acceptance, of being seen, validated, starts to really, really propagate and reinforce that. Because it's not just dozens of medical professionals who are offering that support. It's now hundreds and thousands of people all across the world providing it. So understandably, that becomes very hard to stop. I think that brings up another point around social media, is that it tends to only propagate very dramatic, very attention-grabbing anything. And this is, of course, a attention-grabbing, dramatic sort of experience, right? Being very ill, being ignored by medical health professionals. Because a big part of the content for these kind of individuals is being ignored by mental health providers, by medical providers, which again also just reinforces this entire cycle. And Robin wasn't the only case of this I'd seen in the hospital. Over my 4-year psychiatry training, there would be multiple patients, young patients coming in, with similar presentations of factitious disorder that's reinforced on social media. But now let's get back to what happened after I left Robin's room. I immediately sort of escaped to the call room to gather my thoughts and call Dr. Z, who was attending overnight. And just to fill you in on Dr. Z, who was known in the residency program as not exactly known for his emotional softness. He was definitely a very experienced, very knowledgeable psychiatrist, but blunt to the point of, someone would argue, offensiveness. But actually that night, I figured that's what I needed the most. So I called him up, he answered. So I walked him through the case, everything I'd experienced, witnessed, my interaction with the patient, the outside hospital records, and I wanted to get his thoughts as to what in the world should I do next. But when I finished and asked him that, I just heard silence on the other line, which of course got me nervous. I even wondered if the call had dropped. So I asked Dr. Z, are you still there? And he said very coolly, yes. I asked him, so what do you think I should do? And he answered, there's only one thing you can do. And I remember freezing for a second because, of course, in attending speak, that means you should know the answer. I'm going to wait for you to give it to me. And of course, my mind kind of started racing at that point. I'm like, oh goodness, what do I say? What is the next thing to do? But after a few seconds, it hit me. There was only one thing to do. In factitious disorder, the most dangerous thing you can do is continue providing medical care. Every moment, every second in the hospital introduces an opportunity for the patient to further harm themselves, which can then lead to medical complications, further interventions, and leads the patient closer to death, which is what you want to avoid here. So I realized that. So I said, we have to discharge the patient as soon as possible. and keep them safe while they're here. And then on the other line, I heard the satisfying bingo. Classic Dr. Z. So together we laid out a plan. Immediately, she would have to be put on the maximum safety precautions possible in the hospital. She'd have to be with a one-on-one sitter, so someone constantly in the room monitoring her, eyes on her the entire time. Everything in her room would have to be taken out, stripped. She would have to be searched. No visitors, no belongings, nothing like that, and discharged as soon as medically feasible. Which of course all made sense, but I knew this wouldn't go down well, and there'd be some hell to pay for me. So I went up to the medical unit, and first this time I spoke to the nurses, and they all looked very visibly annoyed with me. Like, why the hell was this psychiatry intern coming in, getting the patient upset, upsetting her, putting on all these draconian precautions? What is going on? So I kind of explained what I had found. They kind of looked skeptical. But then one of the other nurses pulled up the outside hospital records, and I saw her face immediately shift. And then she pulled over some of the other nurses, and they all took a look at the records. And then the dynamic, the tension in the room eased off, but another tension came in its place. They seemed very disturbed, actually very concerned. And one of them said, I can't believe this. This is terrifying. Understandably so. This is a very dramatic, very uncommon, and very scary sort of situation to be in for the nursing staff, because now they have to make sure that this patient, who is very intent and probably very deceptive, and intent on hurting herself, to keep her from doing that, which would not be an easy task. So immediately we called security and had them come in. They would help us. They would come into the room with us and immediately start searching it and confiscating all her goods that she would have returned to her when she left the hospital, but she couldn't have access to while there. So of course we all walked in together. Myself leading the charge, several nurses behind me, and then security coming in. And immediately I could tell she was tense and she knew what was about to happen. And without us even being able to say a word, she started screaming in protest. And then she also did another thing that really caught my attention. She pulled out her phone and she started recording the whole thing. She started recording me, the nurses. Thankfully, it was just pandemic times, we had our masks on. But that was definitely an odd experience as well. But of course, security immediately snatched it from her, as that was part of the orders, was taking away phone, everything like that. And she started screaming again. It was a very very sad, very difficult thing to see. But I had to explain to her why this was happening, what was going on. And she wasn't having it. I could tell she wasn't even listening to anything I was saying. And that's when it happened. One of the security guards took her purse. And immediately as he was pulling it up from beside her hospital bed, 2 syringes fell out. 2. And they fell on the floor. And immediately she started yelling, "Those aren't mine, those aren't mine, you put that there." Security put on gloves and confiscated them. But those syringes were very significant, because as we would later learn, the pattern that was going on at other hospital systems and that could have happened at ours was this. She was intentionally introducing fecal material into her bloodstream during hospital stays to induce sepsis, a life-threatening blood infection. And that's what would prolong her stays, get her different extensive treatments, and all of these other sort of complications that would come up and keep her there. Of course, that could lead to her death. And I'll leave it to her imagination of how she went about that, introducing fecal matter into her bloodstream, but it just kind of highlighted how dangerous this was. It really also underscored the psychological suffering that was underpinning all of this, right? Because if you think about it, someone has to really, really be struggling mentally, have a really unformed sense of self, a really fragile sense of identity in order to do things like this. And it spoke to the real intense need for that sick role and the lack of other sort of things to sustain self-esteem, right? Because if that sick role is that intense to do those kind of life-threatening measures, there must be a lot of psychological hurt underneath all of that. And even for people such as myself, right, in psychiatry, who are used to very, very much of the extremes of human behavior, this is still one that I will never forget. And shortly after this, she was discharged the next day in stable condition, sent off with all her belongings. But she would actually be back. She would be back several times over the years during my training there. And each time would play out in a similar way. I think over time, she learned that there was no opportunity for staying here for prolonged periods, introducing infections, so then she switched to other hospital systems. And of course, there were warnings placed in her chart if she went to other hospitals and things like that. But there's always a workaround. People always find a way. In this case, really made me think deeply about what illness means to various people. And I think about that with all my patients, right? Because everybody takes on a sick role at some point in their life, right? I mean, think about it. I kind of, to some degree, love being pretty sick sometimes, having a stomach bug or a bad flu, because, my wife then dotes on me. I feel taken care of at home. And then there's other sort of sick roles, right, where it's more severe and you are really struggling. Definitely I've known people in my life who've had cancer and even passed away from it, and that's another sick role. And that's filled with a lot of tribulations that I wouldn't wish on anyone, right? And so there are these many sick roles that we take on, all of us, throughout our lives. But for someone like Robin, the sick role becomes their everything. And their social media presence just further magnifies it and reinforces it. And I suspect makes them believe that they are right. Otherwise, why would all these people be praising them, giving them support, telling them that they're right and all these medical professionals are just ignorant or not listening to them? I think this goes way beyond just a need or sense for attention, right? That'd be much too simple of an explanation, because it's not just about attention. It's about our underlying human need for love, care, compassion that I think is sometimes lacking. And if people find it, these kind of almost artificial forms of it online, that in itself can become dangerous. And I think that happens in many ways, not just in factitious disorder, right? But in a lot of ways, people use social media. That's why I think it's so important in life to take stock of what is it that makes you feel whole? What is that makes you feel heard, loved? Are there sort of relationships in your life that maybe could use some more attention, that you could give nurturing to others and have it reciprocated? Are there opportunities to see more people outside of the digital world? Are you getting too much affirmation from online likes or things like that? So I hope you found that story both insightful and thought-provoking. And I really, really appreciate you watching to the end, hearing me out, and I really appreciate you. It's still a new channel, so please like and subscribe, and I'll definitely be back next week with another video on another mental health topic. Thanks so much, and I appreciate you.